Hello, this is Paul Schrader. The year is 2016. I'm making comments on the film Harodcare that I wrote and directed in 1978. So my memory may be a little faulty. It's set in my hometown of Grand Rapids. This is Grand Rapids here. It doesn't look this way anymore. It's been upscaled enormously. There was a snowstorm at the beginning, and we weren't able to shoot the first day. It's the Patland Hotel where we were staying, and so we had to hunker down for a day. This is the block on which I used to live, and that's my father cleaning that car. And that's the production designer cleaning the house is Richmond Hill, where I sledded as a kid. And so it's all a montage of my hometown. Yeah, this is I believe this is Alpine Christian Reformed Church. Paul Silbert was the guy on the steps. And this is this is my church. This is 12th Street. My block again. That was Storm. I was friends with John Milius at this time, and John produced it. I worked at that factory. And then the Grand River. So this script was called Pilgrim when we were shooting it, because we didn't want to alienate the locals with the title Harodcare. My relatives were all celery farmers, so this is set in a celery farm. And, oh yes, when I was a kid on Sunday afternoons, the uncles would sit together after church and discuss doctrine. And if you were a kid, you could sit and listen, but you couldn't join in. Movies were not allowed in this environment, but TV had come in, and there were those who did not approve.
I'm sick of watching this television stuff.
Oh, Joe, what are you doing?
You know who makes it? All the kids who couldn't get along here. They go out to California and make television. I didn't like them when they were here, and I don't like them out there. Television. If you don't buy one yourself, the kids go someplace else and watch.
Yeah, that is a sentiment that I heard at one point in my life. This is my mother in the foreground, who died before the film came out. And my college friend Reiner Van Til singing a song of his own composition.
To play Baby Jesus. Timmy is only 6 months old.
Stand still.
His song goes, man's depravity, just like gravity, leads us down the hill. God's omnipotence, not like our impotence, leads us upward still. Oh, that was in my house. I was a kid, that plaque. And that photo is my grandparents. So this is more or less a montage of memories. I was at that period in my career where I wanted to speak more directly to my background it certainly wouldn't have that appeal anymore. That's my mother there is to George's right.
Here on this occasion, thou knowest our every need. We ask thee to watch over us in the coming year, keep us safe from harm and danger if it be thy will. Bless all our missionaries throughout the length and breadth of this earth. Amen.
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 Here, OJ, please don't touch that.
Sister, would you go and see if Kristen has everything packed?
Of course.
Want to go for coffee after we send the girls off?
No, thanks anyway. I've got to get right over the office.
Yeah, George at this time was not terribly happy man. He had just directed 2 films, and they had both failed, and he had paid to have them forewalled himself. And of course, he had a drinking problem. It was pre-negotiated by his agent, Jane Dacey, who they built in 5 days buffer for alcoholic problems, and it didn't turn out we lost 5 days due to that. And here is the litany of Dutch names that I grew up with. It's actually the Christian Reformed Church. They changed it to the Dutch Reformed in order not to run into some legal complications. But generally, when I was in school, if you were like a Vander A, you were in the first half of the alphabet. And if you were a Vander Z, you were in the second half.
I love you. If you need anything, just call.
So, I mean, the idea for this, it's a variation on the Searchers, where John Wayne's niece gets abducted in the West, and he goes on the search for her. And in this case, this guy, Van Doren's daughter, is lost in California, and he goes on the search for her. Oh, I worked at this factory too. This is a furniture factory.
New shipment came in, huh? It was good. Good.
The first time I met George was at a country club in Bel Air, and we were supposed to have lunch to discuss the script. And he didn't show up, and after lunch, and then Jane says, "I think I know where he is," and we went down to the bar area, and she said, "Here, let me go find him." Now, this score by Jack Nietzsche, I'll come back to that story. This score by Jack Nietzsche is done with glasses, glasses filled with various degrees of water. And the Hungarian artist that Jack brought over would run his fingers around the rims of the glasses and create these tones. So we went into... Jane went into the bar, and after a while, George came out, and he was just wearing his undershorts. And he saw me in the distance and says, "Where's that cocksucker who thinks he can direct?" And at which point I said, "That would be me, George." And Jane went back and collected his clothes. He had a tendency to take off his clothes when he drank, and the bartender had just stacked it up on the bar. So we got him dressed, and he didn't quite know where his house was, but he described it to me, and I recognized it because it was where De Niro had been staying on Raging Bull. So I think I know where this house is, George. And sure enough, we went there, and Jane started pouring coffee into him. His wife, Trish, very quickly left. And, we talked for quite a while. A lot of it was quite angry about his father and about the motion picture business. And at one point, he, looked at the mirror and said, you're a young man. Why would you hire someone with a face as ugly as this? You can hire anybody, and on and on. And at one point, the shotgun comes out and says, I wish I could, I should shoot myself. I should shoot my father. Bit by bit, he sobered up. And finally, we were able to get around to the subject at hand. And we talked a little bit about the film and all that, and he was good with it. He agreed to do it. And Jane quickly excused herself and said, well, her work was done, so she moved on out. And as soon as she was out the door, George pulled out a gallon of vodka and 2 11-ounce glasses. And he said to me, let's have a drink. And at which point it was about 2 in the afternoon. I said, no, I really had to get back to the office. And that was my first experience with George.
I don't know. You know how to play chicken? What's that? You don't know how to play?
Now, this girl, Ilium, she was not a porn actress, although she had done some sort of softcore stuff. But I liked her because, she was not conventionally beautiful and was not the sort of person who was the sort of person who could get very lured by flattery. The whole business of pornography was much different then. You didn't have the cheerleaders in the A team going into pornography at that time like we do now.
Faithful Savior, Jesus Christ.
I believe my parents are in here somewhere. Let's see. Oh, there's my father and my mother in sort of the center of the screen. When the film came out, it was actually called Harodcare, and my parents did not see movies, nor did they approve of them. And when my father died, I was surprised to find that he had videotapes of every film I had been involved in, but they were all in their original wrappers, as if to say, I'm proud of what my son accomplished, but I'd like you to know I have not seen one of them. But in fact, he did see this film, and because my brother told me that he had driven down to Chicago to see it. He didn't want to be seen, locally walking into the theater. And so I said, Dad, Len says that you saw Harodcare. And there's a pause, and he gave me the only bit of film criticism he'd ever given me, which was, yes, and I'm glad your mother was not alive to see it with me. So that was his pronouncement on this occupation. Dick Sargent here plays the brother-in-law. This is before Dick came out of the closet.
There's a ride called the Great White Knuckler, a roller coaster. Last time I saw Kristen, she was standing there.
Why was she alone?
Was she alone?
I told the policeman.
They had met an older boy earlier.
Well, Miss Van Doren, it turns out that the boy your daughter was talking to didn't work the part.
So most of this was shot in Los Angeles. We had to shoot we shot the red light stuff in San Francisco and San Diego because they had what they called at that time combat zones, areas where the X-rated businesses were concentrated. And so, particularly San Diego, because of the Navy base, so we were there quite a bit. We had we started out, we did a week or so in Grand Rapids, and then after the shoot, after the weather changed, because we were shooting in the winter, we came back and did another day in Grand Rapids. The interesting thing about this scene, now, George always, he said to me before we started shooting, you know, he said, I'll give you 2 takes. I'll give you a 3rd take if you need it, but that's about it because the takes will never change. And he was right about that. And in this particular scene, we were shooting, it was coming up to lunch hour. And at that time you had a hard plug, which meant that if you said cut and it was after lunch hour, you had to break. But if you were still rolling, you could shoot into lunch hour. And I had gotten 2 takes from George on this shot here. And I wanted to get a 3rd because some cars were in the background, bright yellow car, and it was disconcerting. But Peter had to go to the bathroom enormously, and he just got up, and he said, I can't hold it anymore. And I didn't want to break. I didn't want to say cut because then we would come back after lunch and George wouldn't give me another take. So I just said to George, can you fly solo? He said, sure, no problem. I said, okay, then let's just do another take. And so he did the scene without Peter. He did his matching. He did Peter's matching. He listened to all of Peter's unspoken lines and gave all of his lines and all of his reactions, just as he had when Peter was there. And during all this, Boyle walked back, and he was watching George give this performance without him. And then we broke for lunch, and Peter said to me, he said, you know, I've been trying to get at this guy, and I can't really get a reaction from him, and now I see why. It doesn't matter if I'm there or not. A couple of years later, Hector Elizondo told me that he had been on stage with George, and George was so nearsighted that he couldn't see other people on the stage. For that reason, George was always wanting to know how many footsteps he took, and he had tried once to use contacts, and he said that he got panicked on stage because he could see everybody, and he could see the audience. Now we're going to go back to, yes, here we are back in Grand Rapids. The snow is gone, and the old downtown is still there. Now this was quote unquote spring. It's probably, my guess, March, but it was pretty cold. And I wanted to put these 3 gents on the on the front porch, which was something that, we would often do. But as you'll see shortly, it was quite cold on that front porch, and they're sitting there shivering. I kind of like the idea of them, thinking that, spring has come and enjoy the weather. There's another story I'd like to tell about George, which is a longer story. And I might as well start it and have to drop off and pick it up again. But this, we were shooting in the Tenderloin in San Francisco on a Saturday night. And we had a simple scene, and there was some action inside the bar, and then he had to walk in and had to say 2 words, where's Rattan, and then exit. And so I said to the AD, what should we do? Should we do the meat, meaning the material that George is not in, or should we just clean up George? And the AD rather foolishly said, let's do the meat first, which was a large mistake, because that left George in his trailer for a number of hours on a Saturday night in San Francisco while we were shooting scenes without him. So that by the time we had the lights all turned around and we were ready for them, I got word that George wasn't going to come out of his trailer. So then so we sent the second AD over, sent the first AD, just a nice tableau here. Sent the first AD over, no good. Called the producer, sent the producer over to his trailer, no good. And then, so finally, I had to go over to George's trailer. I'll pick this story up in a bit. I think we're going to get to the scene now with Peter Boyle. Yeah, we actually shot this exterior. Yeah, we shot this exterior in Los Angeles as if it were Grand Rapids. I had known Peter, of course, from Taxi Driver, and the number of actors I cast in my first films. Harvey Keitel came from Mean Streets, and so I was using people that I had met through Scorsese or De Palma. Now, this scene where he sees the film, George had said to me, he wanted to know, where the camera was, whether the camera was going to be moving, and he said, I'm only going to do this once. And so, I assured him that, by this, I meant the emotional part of it, not that shot from behind. And so I assured him that when it came to the emotional part, this shot here, we would just do it one time from one angle. And so he said, okay. And so we started rolling, and he does, you could see him slowly work up to this and, build up to it. I didn't know exactly what he was going to do. And then he does this turn it off stuff, which has become a bit of a internet meme rather. And then after he sunk to his knees, I said, "Cut," and his face was all wet, and he took his hand and wiped his face and looked at me and said, "Well, how was that?"
Turn it off, please.
The ongoing story, which is the one about the trailer. So George says, "Come in." I go in, and George is sitting in the back of his trailer, again in his skivvies, again quite drunk, been sitting there drinking. And so I went over to him and sat down, and and asked him if he would come out and do this shot. It was just one shot. We were all set up for it. He'd be on his way in a half hour. And he said he's not going to do it. And he said to me, "You're a good writer, but you're a terrible director. And this movie is a piece of shit." And more words to that effect. And I said, "Well, George, often you're making a film, you get disheartened and you don't think it's all going to work. And then, half a year later, you're editing it, and it comes out much better than you thought, and you get a little blinded sometimes when you're right in the face of a problem." And he said, "No, this movie's a piece of shit, and you're a shit director." And I said, I was doing my best and so forth. I said, "No, where are we going to go from here?" This is how my two regrets. One is the ending, and this was supposed to be part of the ending, and the other was a casting thing. I had come to Los Angeles to go to UCLA Film School, and so this is Lenny Gaines. He's another guy from Scorsese's group. Steve Dunn, my assistant. Dave Nichols, also from Scorsese, who was working with me on this film.
Let's go. Wallpaper, it's peeling. Oh, never mind. Keep shooting. We're rolling. Hey, come on. Keep it up. Keep it going. All right, now, Nicky, throw your legs around his shoulders. Ooh, good, sweet. Benny, come on now. Swing around this way, Benny.
I used Lenny Gaines also, and he was a music promoter, a real classic hustler. I used him in Blue Collar as well.
Quick, get some spun glass. Nicky, come on, sweetheart. Now you're lying back. You're feeling good about it. You're setting your mind free. You're thinking about your dad. Your mind is open. It's just. Your kid's a good director.
My little homage to my alma mater.
Benny, come on now. Nicky, to move a little bit more to your right. It's good. This guy, I've never seen three as good as this. To your left.
So going back to San Francisco, I'm trying to figure out how to induce him. And then it hits me. I said, George, if we don't do this shot tonight, it's Saturday night, it means we have to stay over on Sunday. We have to shoot it Monday night. And then we have to travel to San Diego, and we won't shoot then until Wednesday. That means you will be on this film. If you don't shoot tonight, you will be on this film 3 more days. And he thought about that, and he said, okay. He said, I'll do this shot, but on one condition. And he says, you have to promise me that you will never direct another motion picture. And I got on my knees and folded my hands, and I said, George, you're right. I am a good writer, but I'm a bad director, and I promise you now, I will never direct another motion picture. And he slapped me on the back and said, good, let's do it. And we went out, and we did that shot, and the film commenced, or continued. Then later, when we got to going back to Grand Rapids for the spring stuff, which we saw at the house here, we were in the bar at the Palatine Hotel, and there was a big trade ad in which Travolta was being announced as being an American Gigolo, which I was going to direct. And George yelled across the bar and said, Schreier! And I came over, and he showed me the ad, and he said, you promised me you would never direct another motion picture. And I said, George, I'm sorry, I lied. He said, you'll learn. But no, between Richard Pryor, my first film, and George, in my second film, I pretty much hit my quota of colorful stories. I've not had as colorful of performance since then. Now, well, the 2 regrets I have about the film, one is the casting of Susan Hubley, who is a nice enough girl, a nice enough actress, but I just felt she was too pretty. And I had cast Deanna Scarwood, who you may know as being the daughter in Mommy Dearest. Now, this was before Mommy Dearest, and she was an unknown, and I'd cast her. And I thought she was just the right kind of girl for this story, the right look, the right talent. And Dan Melnick, who was the exec over at Columbia at that time, vetoed that. And he said that she wasn't attractive enough to star in the film. And he made me recast, and he got involved in the casting. And we picked Susan because she was classically cute and pretty. And I just felt she was always too pretty for that role. And I wished I had been able to stay with Scarwood, but that was not to be. And my other regret comes around the ending, which was also something that Mr. Melnick insisted I change. And, I learned a good lesson on this film, which is, these compromises never work. If you have to walk or not make a film, it's better than. But this was my second film, and you convince yourself that you can make it work. This second compromise had to do with the ending. And in the script that was sold, and which George originally agreed to do, this guy Jake Van Dorn goes through this sort of Dante-esque underworld, and at the end of it, he discovers that his daughter was killed in a car accident unrelated to pornography. stepping away from that. This is now we are using San Diego here for Los Angeles, and the reason George has his glasses on is because he's blind as a bat, and he couldn't be doing this if he wasn't wearing them. Now, in San Diego, they had about a 8 or 10 square block area, which was just devoted to X-rated enterprises, so that all the sailors wouldn't be all over town. This didn't really work, and in the end, those combat zones were banned, and realized that it worked better if you spread out the sex businesses rather than concentrating them. This is the second movie I did with Jack Nietzsche, who is a legend in the music business. I've only done 1 or 2 films with orchestral type scores. I tend to like more of the ambient or rock or guitar driven scores. So going back to the ending. So the ending of the original script, which sort of mimicked the ending of Chinatown, is after Ramada is killed, or rather Rattan is killed, and Jake discovers that his daughter is dead, and in a manner totally unrelated to pornography. There's nothing that can be done. He has to go back home and live with that memory. And so it's the kind of the Chinatown ending where it says basically Jake is Chinatown. And so the daughter is never rescued or never found. And I like that ending. But again, Columbia and Melnick said that they wouldn't make the film if the daughter is never found. And that was sort of one of the things that I liked most about the script, was that as a twist on the Searchers ending, Debbie is not found, and there is no John Wayne picking up Debbie and saying, "Let's go home." But that, of course, is exactly the ending that Columbia wanted, and that is the ending that we shot. I'll always consider that a mistake. I also, there was about a 6-month period where Warren Beatty wanted to do this, and I fooled around with Warren, going up to his place at the Beverly Wilshire every day and working on the script. Warren, of course, felt that he was too young to have a daughter, and who wanted to make it a girlfriend and this and that. It was a very interesting time, and I learned a lot about Mr. Beatty in that, his absolute perseverance. He will just pick at a thing over and over and over again until he wins. And an understood part of his success as a Don Juan is the absolute perseverance. Now, this picture, the production design was by Paul Silbert, who's the brother of Dick Silbert, who did Chinatown. And so, it gave us a chance to do a lot of this kind of gaudy stuff, like that entrance that we just built. We leaned rather heavily on the gels in this film. And I think as a result, in the next films, I started moving away from the gels. I got so gel crazy on this that I didn't. I made a point, starting with Gigolo, to start backing off all those use of gels.
Oh, sí, señor. Sexo, sí. Sí, señor. Sexo, sí.
So much of this film is just a slow burn, the fun of putting George in these environments and just watching his reactions. So, the ending, it would have been better if he had just had to live with this. The ambiguous ending is always better. Give the audience something to think about when they hit the sidewalk. I did a bit of research when I was making this film into this world, and then I did it again when I came to do autofocus, the Bob Crane's obsession. And then when I did Canyons and got to know James Dean, had another sort of go-round and watched the economics of the sex business in Los Angeles change rather dramatically.
Just wait in here. I gotta get a sheet. You still dressed?
Yeah, well, I want to.
Why don't you just relax, huh?
The crew members, we were in this red light district, I think, for almost 3 weeks. And the crew members initially were sort of excited, being around all these working girls and all this porn and all this sex stuff. But that only lasted about a week. And by the time we were finished, I had more than one crew member say, "Boy, I'm going to be glad to get out of this." He said, "I haven't been able to touch my wife in 3 weeks now." So it's not quite as glamorous as it might appear from the outside. No, but I do have to admit, there was a large element of the kid in the candy shop here, particularly someone from my background who, very prudish Victorian, sort of kept away from all these sinful matters, and then being able to sort of just jump in the mud. I probably did more research than what was necessary. I remember at one point I had an office on the lot at Columbia, and this dominatrix came in for an interview, And I was sort of asking her how she went about it, and she said, "Well, why don't I show you?" And then the next thing I knew, I'm on all fours with her foot in my back, and I have to admit it was. It was a fun kind of ride, but I was glad when it was over too.
Find some answers.
Hey, man, would you just wait a minute?
Well, who runs this place? Is it that blonde guy out there? Is that who it is? I'm going to talk to somebody. Where the bastard runs this shithole?
Hey, what's the problem?
He's causing trouble.
I got a picture here. I want you to help me find this woman. I've been asking everybody. Nobody knows anything.
Listen. Just cool it. Listen, we don't want the cops in here. Listen, you got a family?
I suppose you haven't seen her either. Her name is Krishna. I suppose you've never seen her.
Why'd you go out there?
Shut up!
How's that for that? That's it. Cool it. You're gonna get it. Knock it off. Yeah, bitch.
Looking at this now, you can see how much the sense of lighting has changed. This is all so bright. That's how films were made then. Everything had to be bright. Today, with the new cameras we have and the new lights we have and the new sensibility we have, all of this would have been much darker. It was the whole sense that you had to be able to see everything, and particularly you had to be able to see it when it was put on television. And I constantly look back at these films in the 70s, and I'm surprised at how bright they are, and that some of these so-called famous Star Wars had just opened. There it is. Some of these famous cameramen, we now think of as famous, were just so bright. That sign was right by the Chateau Marmont there. That Think Pink. Here's Lenny Gaines again doing his Lenny Gaines imitation. Scorsese had come across him in the whole sort of music business. I forget. I think it was Medicine Ball Caravan, one of those films that Marty had done, and he used Lenny, and Lenny was so electric that I used him too. My little New York Film Festival homage here. David Nichols, I met through Scorsese, and he was associate producer on this film.
Hi, I'm Jake DeVries. I'm here to see Mr. Ramona.
Oh, that was my secretary.
Where's my accountant?
He's got a bad stomach.
He's got a bad stomach. Hello. Yeah, what is it, Georgia?
There's Mr. Freeze here to see you.
Mr. DeFreeze.
There was a time when there was this sort of myth that there would at some point be an X-rated feature. It never happened, and it never will. And now we know some of the science behind it, which is, it's really two parts of the brain. The part of your brain that responds to long-form narrative is a different part of the brain that responds to erotic images. And so that when one is triggered, it chills the other. And so they're essentially working at cross purposes, the idea of a narrative and the idea of sexual arousal. And so that notion that you could have a long-form narrative complete with scenes of sexual arousal never really worked. And a number of people have tried it, and And I don't think any of them ever work because they go against basic chemical, biology.
Learn how it's done.
I'm curious, Jake. What business are you in?
I have my own business. We make rivets for the auto industry. We sell to fishermen.
Rivets. That sounds like a good, solid American business, right, Kurt?
Right.
Sit down, will you?
So now I guess Jake is going to fancy himself a producer. I've had opportunity to sort of think back on the various films I've made and, what kind of strings them together. And it's always sort of curiosity to try to push something just a little bit further. And sometimes it works commercially and sometimes it doesn't. In this case, the hardcore thing, though it seems relatively tame by today's standards, was just probably a little too much at that time. In Blue Collar, it was the Marxism, but then sometimes it works out, like with Gigolo. I remember Penny Marshall, who I knew at this time, said to me once, she said, the problem with you, Paul, is that there's always a line when you're doing something, and that you walk right up to the line, and then you step over it. And in the stepping over it gets to be the interesting part. I just finished a film, Dog Eat Dog, where we stepped over the line again. Oh, I used to work at the LA Free Press. That was my first job. Pauline Kael, who was my kind of mentor. This is obviously not the Free. Pauline Kael, who was my mentor, got me a job there because publications would call up and ask her to recommend people. And she had gotten me into UCLA Film School, and she got me a job at the Freep. And so I was their film critic from 68 through 69. I finally lost my job when I panned Easy Rider, which was a kind of sacred script for them, but then I continued doing other things. And another guy I've used on a number of films, Ed Begley. I just saw him in a film recently. He was also in Blue Collar. Yeah, Michael Chapman shot this film. Michael had shot A Taxi Driver. I do feel, just looking at this here, it's all just too bright. But that was, as I said before, a part of the time. The Taxi Driver wasn't as bright because they were using a lot of hidden footage. But still, when I saw a Taxi Driver recently at a 40th anniversary screening, and it is still, right by today's standards. There will come a point, I think, if memory serves, where you'll see Michael Chapman doing his cameo in this film.
Nice meeting you.
You're really good, kid. That really helps.
All right, come on, get back in
When I said that thing earlier about season, and it is sort of true. I mean, I don't really mean to knock her. I just felt that for the time, she was too pretty. Now, today, of course, in today's porn, that kind of prettiness is de rigueur. But back then, many of the actresses were second-tier beauties, and I felt that Season was too pretty. You can hear a little bit of Nietzsche's glasses playing here, along with a little synth. It was interesting. The first film I did with Jack, Blue Collar, it really didn't have the Moog yet, and so he was using something called a mellotron, which was loops of pre-recorded sounds, such as crows or bees, and then you would play a keyboard, and you would trigger these pre-recorded loops, and they would make sounds. And by the time this came around a year later, he was able to start using a synth, and then by the time the next film I did, another 2 years later, Gigolo, then we were all into that synth world. And now we've moved to a place where there's very little difference anymore between music and sound effects. It's really almost become the same job. Now, here again is a scene that no one today would shoot this bright, unless, of course, they were shooting for television. It's just, unnaturally bright. But, and in those days, you had to hang, so much light and balance so much light. One of the reasons films have become so cheap and you can shoot so quickly is because you don't spend that much time lighting anymore. This film took, I think, 43 days to shoot. Today, you would shoot this film in 25.
Yes, it's open. Come in.
Jake, Mr. Holcomb?
Mm-hmm. Pete?
Yeah, Peter Lumley.
I have to admit that the ugliness of this decor I found kind of wearing, exhausting. And I guess I was so fed up with it that I turned against gels, and I turned against these kind of colored walls, and gradually I swung back. When I did touch, I allowed painted walls again, and then in the last film I did, we did quite a bit of gel work, although it's not gels anymore, it's LCDs. But I don't know if I could make a film anymore this relentlessly unattractive.
I'm Dick Black.
This fellow's name was Dick Williams, and I think he had just been in Roots, where I had seen him. A lot of things in this film make me cringe a little bit because it is a youthful film. It is, it was my sophomore directing experience, and it is a bit sophomoric. This sort of giddiness with its own salaciousness. But no, that may be part of the attraction.
You're not exactly the type. We had something a little different in mind.
Don't you want to see my stuff, man?
What stuff?
You know, my, stuff.
Yeah, sure. All right, thank you very much.
Another thing I'm noticing about this film is how little I move the camera. I mean, from time to time, I'll do an interesting shot, but for the most part, it's just static. I really hadn't quite figured out how to direct yet. I don't think I really directed a film visually until American Gigolo. This really is more a sense of illustrated pictures rather than a visual of capturing a world through visual investigation and visual imagination. I just couldn't imagine shooting any of these scenes this way. And one of the things that bothers me about the recent development of long-form television is that, for the most part, these films are being shot very unimaginatively. There are exceptions like Mr. Robot, but it's like we had gotten to a very nice point in terms of camera movement, and now we're just going back, and films are being shot in a much more routine manner for all these shows.
Come on, sit up, Trash. We're gonna take a little shower together.
Okay. Don't hit me anymore.
Where's the girl? Where is she?
Yeah, I don't, apart from a colorful story here and there, I don't remember spending a lot of time with George. He was very, very professional, when he was sober. It was, 2 takes. He had everything all worked out. Always knew his lines, everything. And there was not a whole lot of need to talk about the character and the motivation. It was all pretty much right there. Now, in this upcoming scene, if memory serves, and it doesn't necessarily serve because I keep seeing things I don't remember, but I think this is where we're going to get a look at Michael Chapman, the cinematographer, and also, ironically, the lightsabers from Star Wars. Now, I knew Lucas, and Star Wars had just come out, and I thought that would be cool, have this is Michael Chapman here, the DP on the bed. I thought it'd be cool to have these dancers doing this sort of Darth Vader Star Wars thing. And so I called up George and asked him, and he said, sure. Now, you know, in the way things have gone on in the history of Star Wars, you know, that could never happen again. I think that they were all a bit surprised by the phenomenon that Star Wars became, and the idea of letting strippers use Star Wars paraphernalia would not have been approved at a later point. I learned an interesting lesson here. We shot this film in 1:8:5, which means that there's a slight band on the top and the bottom of the frame. Now, so that shot right there, when you looked at that full frame, you would see that Susan is wearing panties, because it was below the frame line and there was no reason for her to be naked, because it would always be cropped just as you're seeing it now. Well, when they put this on television, they used the full frame because the TV format is less horizontal. And so when I saw this on TV, or was it on videotape? I think it's videotape. She throws her feet up on the glass and you see her underwear, which, you know, a moment before she didn't have on. So I learned the whole lesson of the hard mat, which is when you put in a hard mat, you close off that part of the negative that you don't want to be seen. And of course, the studios at that time didn't want you to use a hard mat because they wanted that additional visual information for the TV format. All of which, of course, is a moot point in the world, in the post-film world we're in.
You're a private detective?
Something like that. How much you make?
Here? Oh, what a joke. There was some other detective asking about that girl.
300?
This is just temporary. I once made 900 in alcohol.
I'll give you $700 a week cash if you'll help me find this girl.
Up front?
Yeah, I like the all the jism stains here on the plexi. We went to some work, I remember, to place them all there. Here's a scene I do not remember. I don't remember where we shot this. I don't remember why we shot it. Oh, I get it now. He's going to try to rehire this Peter Boyle guy. You know, the truth is I don't go back and I don't see these films. You know, I saw Dog Eat Dog 3 weeks ago in Cannes, and that's probably the last time I will see it. I just don't feel a need to revisit these films. I tend to say that when you go back and look at your work, one of two things can happen. One, you look at it and you say, God, I was talented then. Where did my talent go? Or you look back at it and you say, I didn't have any talent then, and I still don't have any talent. So it's a kind of a lose-lose proposition. In this particular case, it's more of the latter. You know, I just, so much of the time I didn't know what I was doing here. And for those younger folks, the Roarer 714 was the pharmaceutical quality Quaalude, which was a truly great and sorely missed drug. Yeah, we made that T-shirt. A number of costume ideas I had at the time.
You go to your room and we'll both get a good night's sleep.
You got anything to drink? You want to go out and get something?
I don't drink. You can go out if you want to.
You don't drink?
Ulcers.
You're not a private detective either, are you?
No.
I didn't think so. I fuck detectives. Who are you?
So I'm building up this relationship between the two of them, which gives me a chance a little bit to look into my father's world. Ironically, I made 2 films about my parents. I made this film, Hardcore, about my father, and I made Light of Day about my mother. And I think they're 2 of my worst failures. I just, well, we'll get back to, we're now in the Burbank airport, and he's going to do the Tulip. Now, the Tulip is the acronym that we use to define Calvinism. And I'm going to just let George explain the Tulip here to you, so I don't have to.
It's an acronym. It comes from the canons of Dort. Every letter stands for a different belief, like, you sure you want to hear this?
Yeah. Please, go on. I'm a Venusian myself.
Well, T stands for total depravity. All men, through original sin, are totally evil and incapable of good. All my works are as filthy rags in the sight of the Lord.
That's what the Venusians call negative moral attitudes.
Well, be that as it may, U stands for unconditional election. God has chosen a certain number of people to be saved, the elect, and he's chosen them from the beginning of time. L is for limited atonement. Only a limited number of people will be atoned and go to heaven. I is for irresistible grace. God's grace cannot be resisted or denied. And P is for the perseverance of the saints. Once you're in grace, you cannot fall from the numbers of the elect. That's it.
Before you...
Yeah, that's the Tulip, all right. I remember trying to get my head around that many a time, but it's intrinsically, contradictory. The interesting thing about Calvinism was that Calvin was very much an intellectual, and he really believed that you could think your way to heaven. And he created this huge edifice of logic. And in his Institutes, volumes 1 and 2. And but in the middle of that edifice, there was a little pinhole, and then through that pinhole, faith came. But what Calvin didn't understand was that a pinhole of faith is approximately the same size as a barn door of faith. Because once faith gets in the argument, logic is no longer in charge. But he did do a fair amount of logic. This is San Diego again, finally in the daytime.
Is Rucker here? He'll be back in a couple of hours.
Yeah, tell him Louise was here. We'll come back later.
You want it?
God, I wish I'd moved the camera. Oh my God, an actual camera move.
Shouldn't eat all that junk anyway. It's no good for us.
At least I'm a growing person, huh?
And you won't keep growing long at this rate.
Don't start coming down on me. You know, what I do is important. I mean, there are a lot of guys who can't.
This film also can serve as a sort of flashback book to a particularly unattractive moment in American fashion.
Off guys all day? Think I'm just a fuck face? You can't even say it, can you?
You know, this is not, I mentioned before watching this film for the first time in decades. It's not the most comfortable experience. I've mentioned camera movements and mentioned the lighting, mentioned the set design, all of which I have problems with. But I also have problems with the writing. I mean, there's a kind of didactic nature to this stuff that I wouldn't do. This right here is a perfect example of overwriting, of over-indicating, saying things that you don't need to say. Basically, sophomoric writing. You know, the more and more I've made films and written, the more and more I realize the less and less you really need to do. And that this notion of telling people stuff is really not what we should be doing in the arts. You know, the being an artist is not standing on a soapbox, or for that matter, standing in a pulpit. And I, made that segue as a young man from someone who was going to be a minister and who was pre-sim to then becoming a filmmaker. And it took me a while to realize that I wasn't just stepping into a pulpit of a different sort, and that this idea of telling people stuff and preaching to people was completely antithetical to what an artist should be doing, which is, investigation through implication and association, and none of this kind of didactic stuff. I wish I could bring this young filmmaker who did this film into the room here so I could slap him around a bit and tell him to get it together.
He deals in pain.
Is Kristen safe? Let's get a plane to San Francisco.
Apparently your friend slipped down into San Diego. And now he's headed up to San Francisco. How's it feel to have the LAPD doing your police work for you?
Yeah, we had over at Tribeca Film Festival, there was a 40th anniversary for a taxi driver a month or two ago. And surprisingly enough, we were all there. Peter was Peter and Julia Phillips. Peter was the only actor who, the main actor who had deceased. Well, here we are finally in San Francisco. That's Coppola's Zoetrope office in the Chartreuse down the block there.
At that bookstore down there at 4 o'clock tomorrow. Okay. I told him you're a specialty customer.
Why can't I meet him now? Nicky? Why can't I meet him now?
He's busy now.
Where does he live?
Another thing that strikes me in watching this after all the years, other than the things I've mentioned before, was the pace. You know, people talk a lot about 70s movies, this and that, but they are kind of hard to watch because of the pace. You know, everything takes so long. We have paced up our movies and paced up our lives. And, you know, if I took this film into the editing room today, I'd be a lot shorter. It's another one of the T-shirts we designed for Season. She's actually quite good in this scene. Although, you know, to be honest and to be repetitive, so much of this I do not remember. And I don't remember when this came out. I don't think I did much publicity for this. I think I was already working on Gigolo. You know, I mean, at the time I was unhappy with the film because of the ending, which I felt was wrong. Now it's a real curio of a certain point in you know, my life and a certain point in American cinema. To me, it's more of a curio than it is or a document than it is a genuine artistic achievement.
Mate goes to Granville.
Where?
Granville. My old man. Camp to you.
And just listening to the writing here, you know, it's almost like you're checking off a list of things you want to say. It's not really the way people talk. Certainly not these people. You know, you're just checking off all the things you want to say. I remember I had dinner with Warren Beatty about 20 years after this, and I had something I was trying to get him to do, and he said to me, he read the script, he liked it. He said to me, he said, you know, you've become a pretty good writer. And at the time, I was a little offended because I thought I had been a good writer. But looking at this film, there is some good writing in here, but there's more bad writing than there is good writing in here. At least from my perspective today, writing which indicates and writing which specifies and preaches and repeats.
You gotta tell me. Why don't you tell me something for a change? Like what? Who's Rattan? Where did you hear that name? I just heard.
Yeah, in some ways, a lot of this goes back to John Milius, who is a kind of a legendary figure, and who I was hanging around with when I wrote this script, and who produced the movie. He, by nature, was inclined to bombast, to be obvious about things, to be big about things. And that certainly this film is full of unnecessary obviousness, particularly given the subject matter.
She's the victim. Dime a dozen.
Now, if memory serves, we're building up to this snuff movie sequence, which was intended in the original script to sort of be rock bottom, where this character finally gets so embedded in the muck that he can never return to the life he once had with any kind of sanguineness or balance. And he ends up just being the original ending. He ends up having these restless nightmares and not being able to sleep, not because his daughter is dead, but because he has taken this journey into the underworld. And so the ultimate journey then would be a snuff film. Now, at the time we did this, snuff films were, well, it wasn't certain that they actually existed. They were talked about, and, there was always some sort of, Mexican thing, and a girl in Mexico got killed, and, you always heard that somebody who knew somebody else who heard somebody else who had seen one. And I don't doubt that they did exist in certain rarefied ways, but certainly not in the way there was in the public imagination. And in my research into this film, I certainly was not able to locate one. They now, of course, we do have them, and thanks to the internet, you can actually watch them, and thanks to the omnipresence of cell phone video, you can, shoot people being killed. But at this time, it was a kind of an urban myth. They were not really available. I'm sure there were private collectors somewhere who had some, but they weren't available in the way they are in this film. Topless lady wrestling. There's a lost art. I don't remember where this location was. It sure looks like a set. Oh, there's a character sitting there wearing Travis Bickle's jacket from Taxi Driver with the same sort of hair and mustache that I had at the time I was directing this. I had gotten that jacket after Taxi Driver. It's now at the University of Texas in Austin at the Ransom Center. But I had it in my possession. And so I was able to put myself in a little cameo here at the 9th level of hell in my Travis Bickle jacket. I always, whenever you make a film, there are always crew members who are trying to get you to do a cameo and appear in front of the camera. And I've always resisted. That was sort of the closest I came to it was putting someone else in there in my stead, until this last film, which was the one with Nick Cage and Willem Dafoe, which I finally did do a cameo on. Oh, I think that must be one of Norman Lear's shows, because I had done the previous film for a company that Norman owned, and so that's probably where I got the rights for that TV show. Now, this is a nice scene. I just stopped this recording for a second so I could watch this scene because I hadn't remembered it. But the scene with George and Susan coming up, it has a nice weight and complexity to it. I just wish I'd done it a little more service. The brightness of this stuff is just mind-boggling. I want to put my sunglasses on. The brightness, the staticness. I don't know what we were thinking back then. And and it was right around this time that The Godfather came out, and people were so upset. Said, "Oh, you can't see everybody." That was the whole notion at the time. You had to see everybody. So here they are. They look like they're in a supermarket.
All right.
Did you find out where she is?
Todd disappeared. I've got to find him. Where does he live?
What happened?
Where is he?
I can't tell you that.
Listen to me, young lady. My daughter's been missing for 5 months, and I've gone through a lot to try to find out what's happened to her.
Yeah, I like this scene, I have to admit. I like it because, he's lying. When he comes up and he says, "I'm not going to forget you," of course he's going to forget her. Or, of course, he's going to want to forget her. Try to forget her.
I won't forget you.
What are you doing, Pilgrim? Look, where are you going? Look, let me take care of this. I don't want you to get hurt. Look, don't do anything till the police get there. Look, you gotta tell me where he's gone.
Like this old-fashioned kind of drama. Like you have to tell the audience everything. if you just cut that scene out, you'd be fine. The audience would put it together. You don't need all that extra expositional shoe leather. There's a shot in this location where we dolly with George down that San Francisco street. And the dolly was too heavy to hold when it went down the street. So we had to set up 2 dollies on 2 tracks that counterbalanced each other. And so that one dolly followed the character and the other dolly acted as a counterbalance. But this was a stage we built, and the reason for building it will become known quite shortly.
What girls do you have here?
Well, I'm Hope. This is Faith. Charity.
So you have us 3 girls?
I think you made a mistake. Why don't you check on down the street? Different address.
I know he's here.
Wait a minute.
There was a near Universal. There was a that's Dick Ramos, and he's the casting director. There was a House of Dominance near Universal that I researched, which had a room like this, all the different types of whips and so forth. Well, we built it so we could go from through the colored rooms. And here's where we're using the counter dolly, because we couldn't have control of the dolly going down on this angle. It sure looks like George doing his own stunts there.
Hey, who the fuck that? El Matador, he goes there.
Now, this is the shot I mentioned earlier, where all he has to do is walk in this room and say rattan, and, well, I guess there's more to it than that. But I had made the mistake of shooting a lot of that stuff on the inside first. So then we had to talk George into getting out of his trailer, and I had to promise not to work again. That was a real place, the Garden of Eden. It was there actually for quite a long time in San Francisco. Now, this is the scene that was added at the studio's insistence. And we shot it on a little set in Los Angeles. Again, an overlit set. You know, it's a nice enough scene for what it is. It's just not what I had in mind. You know, what I had in mind, as I said before, was that he kills Rattan and finds out his daughter has been dead for some time, and there had been a car accident. And then he has to go back home and try to put that life he had back together.
Don't touch me, you cocksucker. You never gave a fuck about me before. You didn't. So don't touch me now.
And one of the complications of changing the ending was that this girl had been cast essentially because she would do the nudity, and she had been in softcore, but she wasn't cast because she was such a strong actress. But then they changed the ending, and all of a sudden you had to create a performance here. And so I had to, you know, work with her quite a while to try to, you know, get her to do this. In the end, you know, she does as well as you can do with a scene that, you know, is problematic.
It's just my damnable pride.
Just get away. Please.
You really want me to go?
No.
So there's The Searchers ending. John Wayne and Lou Wood.
Break it up, okay? There's nothing there to see. It's all over. Come on now.
Nicky, maybe there's some way I can. Andy? Think maybe you can do something for him? Maybe money, maybe
Go home, Governor. There's nothing you can do. You don't belong here.
And that's the remnant of the whole Chinatown ending. You know, go home, nothing you can do, you don't belong here. And that Pilgrim, what the Peter Boyle calls the Van Doren character, was the title we used while shooting, so that we wouldn't have to explain why we were shooting a movie called Harodcare. And then go back to Precious Memories. This is where we open. Well, that was exhausting. At least I won't have to do it again. Thank you for listening.